Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the National Archives welcome to the National Archives of Finland, to this seminar, Eagles of the Past and of Today. As we are in Finland, we shall start punctually. There will be persons still coming and they will join us as they come. Some practical notes. My name is Jussi Nuortela, I'm Director General of the National Archives, and we will have also UN youth who are helping us with the practical arrangements, with the microphones and also guiding the persons inside here. We will have the presentation so that we have half an hour for each presentation, but I hope that we will be able also during that time to take questions and to answer them. I know that all the speakers are experienced and will be able to enhance also discussion. That is one of the main purposes of the conference that we have. Some of you who are staying, or the speakers, tomorrow also are going to visit the Finnish Academy of Sciences and Letters. We will come here to the National Archives. It is not very far from here, 9:15, so that those who have informed their willingness to join us to the Academy of Sciences and Letters tomorrow here, 9:15. And now I will give the floor to Research Director Dr. Päivi Happonen. Päivi, please.
Good morning and welcome to the National Archives to participate in the conference Eagles of the Past and of Today. History is full of alliances and unions which have broken up as a result of bloody conflicts and wars. In the 1800s, many empires changed. During that century, empires which had earlier been magnificent lost their meaning, and this open space was taken by the rising great powers, the British Empire, empires of Russia and Germany, Austria-Hungary, the United States, where the industrial development was quick, but whose military power, compared to others, was still very weak, and the strengthening France and the Empire of Japan, which was becoming a major power in Asia. The world was ruled by the empires, which were fighting about the power, just as was the case during the centuries. Since the Roman Empire, but partly before that, the symbol of the empires had been the eagle. When the empires collapsed, this symbol was transferred to new empires in an interesting way. It was used by Napoleon's France, the United States of America, the Empire of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. 100 years ago, the most common constitution in the world was a monarchy. Republics were single exceptions. Social change, however, demanded more power to citizens. In many places, citizens rose to barricades before the outbreak of the First World War. There were only a few radical changes. Political power was, however, transferred more and more to decision makers voted in elections. Uniting the nation above politics was the task of the sovereigns. According to Niall Ferguson, British historian, the common idea is that the breakdown of empires will take hundreds of years. This is not the case, however, as according to Ferguson, collapses can also be realized quickly and without a warning, like a thief in the night. The era of the First World War caused great changes to power relations. The Ottoman Empire weakened, but the difficult war also launched its renewal. Austria-Hungary was dispersed to pieces, and Germany's imperial time ended in a bitter defeat suffered in the war. The Russian Empire also collapsed, and the power was taken by the new Bolshevik leadership, whose target was the world revolution according to Marxist theory. The United States, for its part, sought its economic strength by directing the economy to quickly support war struggles. Other winners of the war, especially Britain and France, strengthened their positions during the war and after it took over new territories. The League of Nations was also established at the same time. Its goal was to offer a new forum to global discussion which would lead to that result that international problems would not be solved by military actions anymore. The Second World War also changed the great power relations radically. The Cold War emphasized the position of the most important great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The League of Nations remained very weak, and it was replaced by the United Nations, who was responsible for a wide field of tasks. Changes during the last decades have again raised the question concerning the position of the great powers in world politics. Also, concern about the position of the United Nations and its sister agencies has aroused. Our intention in this seminar is to examine great power politics during the last 100 years. This seminar is also a part of Finland's 100th anniversary. And that is why one goal of the seminar is to give some background information on Finland's independence development in the context of international politics. Before its independence in 1917, Finland was a part of the Russian Empire, but above all, a part of rapidly developing Europe. Technical innovations, new ideas, as well as trends of arts and culture were mainly observed from Western Europe. Finland's state and national development was strongly linked with the development of other Europe and was dependent on it. Finland's social development was advanced and rapid. Finnish women were the first in Europe to exercise the right to vote and to stand as a candidate in elections. In the parliamentary elections in 1907, all in all, 19 female candidates were chosen to be the first female members in the parliament in the world. First in Europe, women had the opportunity to participate in legislation and supreme political decision-making. The reform aroused great interest in Europe and strengthened the trust that Finland could develop its social structures and act as a sovereign state. The last years of the Russian Empire was emphasized by the urge to bind the minorities and the fringes to the empire and to promote unification. The result was different. Radical unification activities increased the urge to secede from the Russian Empire. Only few countries succeeded to regain independence. In addition to Finland, we could mention Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The history of these countries is linked in many ways to Finland and to the long journey towards independence. The power relations of world politics have changed in many ways during the 100 years since Finland's independence. Today, the question about the role of the great powers is as topical as it was 100 years ago. We have had the opportunity to follow the amazing economical development and the increase of political influence of China during the last decades. The collapse of the Soviet Union was largely reflected to the great power politics at the beginning of the 1990s. The political trend, the increased nuclear power threat, and the position of multilateral organizations are interesting questions. This does not concern only political decision-making, but also global handling of problems. This seminar has been arranged in cooperation with many organizations. On behalf of the organizers, I want especially thank for the embassies which have contributed to this project and who have helped us to get high-class speakers to the conference. I would also like to give my thanks to the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Finnish Historical Society, Historiska Förening, Historians Without Borders, as well as UN Youth of Finland and Helsinki for their contribution to arrangement and to make this event happen. The Ministry of Education and Culture and the Finnish Society of Science and Letters have also given their help to arrange this seminar. Your Excellencies, chairs of the conference, dear speakers, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all an interesting and rewarding conference. I would warmly like to thank you for your contribution to this event.
And as you see, the first session will be chaired by Professor Tiina Kinnunen. She is president of the Finnish Historical Society. Tiina, please.
So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to chair this first session with highly interesting topics and distinguished scholars. And our first speaker comes from the St. Petersburg State University. Dr. Irina Novikova is a distinguished scholar of international relations and foreign policy. She is professor at the Department of European Studies and Dean of the School of International Relations at her university. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Arvoisat herrat, dear colleagues, I'm very grateful to the National Archives of Finland for the opportunity to take part in this important international conference. My personal scientific interests include the diplomatic history of First World War in the Baltic Sea region and gaining Finland's independence in international context. This year is a special year in the history of Russian-Finnish relations. We mark the centenary of the Great Russian Revolution and Finland's independence. My presentation is dedicated to some aspects of the impact of breakdown of Romanov's monarchy, the Russian Revolution, 1917, on Finland in context of gaining independence. To begin with, I would like to point out that I proceed from the concept of Great Russian Revolution, according to which the Russian Revolution lasted from 1917 to 1920, 1922, and went from several stages: the February period, October stage, then the stage of civil wars. In this paper, special attention I try to pay to Finland's policy of Russian Tsars and the period between the February and October Revolution of 1917. It was one of the most tense and dramatic periods in the history of Russian-Finnish relations. During the few months, the provisional government undertook a series of desperate attempts to preserve the unity of Russian Empire in a brand new democratic form, but this politics turned out to be unsuccessful. From Finland's incorporation into the Russian Empire in 1809, there was a special relationship between the Russian Tsars and Finland. Alexander I had consciously limited his own power in Finland, taking the title of Grand Duke and promising to rule by the Grand Duchy of Finland on the basis of so-called constitutions, which meant the basic laws from the Swedish times. Alexander I also demanded that information about Finland affairs should reach him directly through the state secretariat of the Grand Duchy, headed by a state secretary, and not through the Russian ministers. The Tsar gave Finland more freedom and privileges than had the Swedish king. It was difficult to explain this fact in terms of the logic of imperial rule, that Finland, as a part of Russian Empire, continued to live according to the laws of the time of Swedish rule, and the Russian emperors did not see this reality as a threat. Then, in the times of Nicholas II, some representatives of the ruling elite tried to inspire the emperor for closer Finland's integration into the Russian Empire. But so-called gendarme of Europe, Nicholas I, remarked, "Leave Finns in peace. There is only province in my great realm, which during my whole reign has not cost me even a minute of concern or dissatisfaction." He strongly believed in the Finnish loyalty. Under the Tsar Liberator, Alexander II, Finland obtained greater rights, and consequently, the Finns held him in great esteem. Alexander II was actually more admired in Finland than in Russia. So Alexander, the so-called counter-reformer Alexander the Third, had real opportunity to observe the loyalty of the Finns to the Russian Empire during the Russo-Turkish War. In his memoirs, prominent Russian statesman Sergei Witte, who was in close relations with Alexander III, pointed out that the Tsar told him the following: "Finland's constitution does not please me. I will not permit its further expansion. But I'm just as bound to uphold that which my predecessors have granted to Finland, as if I granted it myself. And I asserting the throne, I confirmed by my word to inviolability of Finland's special autonomous status. Despite his strong conservative views, Alexander III personally sympathized with Finland and believed in Finnish monarchism and loyalty. And so the policies of so-called Russification carried out in Poland and in Baltics were not extended to Finland. Romanov's policy towards Finland was largely determined by military and strategic factors, and in particular its importance for security of the capital of Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. They understood that if they were to rule Finland peacefully, they had to give it more rights and privileges than it had enjoyed under Swedish rule. Therefore, Russian Tsars tried to awaken sympathy in the Finnish society to Russian regime. As historian Cruzius Arenberg pointed out, Finland served as the European facade of Russia, which was supposed to show the Western public opinion that joining to Russian Empire is good for a small nation. On the whole, by the end of 19th century, the Russian Tsar as a Grand Duke was the common head of state for Finland and Russia. Finland and Russia had a common foreign and military policy, but with the Grand Duchy, the Tsar was a constitutional monarch, granting broad autonomy, pragmatic cooperation with local Finnish elite, religious tolerance had become the factors that for almost a century have been supporting the respect and loyalty of Finns and Finland towards the Russian Empire and the Russian Tsars. In fact, it was only during the reign of Nicholas II when relations between Russia and Finland gave a deep split. Russian attitude towards the Finnish autonomy changed radically under Nicholas II, who tried to integrate the Grand Duchy into the imperial governmental system. Nicholas II's Finnish policy was conditioned by unfavorable military, strategic, geopolitical, economic factor, influence of ideology of conservative nationalism, and the imminent European war, which made him particularly fearful that his non-Russian subjects might follow the Finnish example. Some Russian nationalists wondered, what if after Finnish state come Estonian and Livonian Grand Duchies, a kingdom of Poland, Ukrainian hetman state with their own coins, custom houses, post office, financing system. What will happen then to defense of Russia against the foreign enemy? It should be pointed out that the ruling Russian largely excluded the majority of the Grand Duchy population from their fears, believing separatists were to stand for the Finland-Swedish elite, who were suspected in separatism for Sweden. Better relations between Russia and Sweden added credence to right-list claims. Petersburg feared a military alliance between Germany and Sweden, and Russian General Staff regarded Sweden as Russia's potential enemy in the Baltic in case of European war. As a consequences of these anxieties, imperial leadership distrusted more to Swedish elite in Finland. A new Finnish policy of Russian ruling elite appeared as a kind of traditional policy, divide and rule, setting the Finns against the Swedes to dominate both. The situation reminds that in the Baltic provinces, where the imperial power upheld the local population against the German upper class, then suspected of treason in the case of Russo-German war. The new imperial policy towards Finland was connected with Governor General Nicholas Bobrikov. His activity reflected both the ruling elite and Russian nationalists' prejudices. Some Finnish people falsely thought that Nicholas II had a poor view about Bobrikov's experiments. However, his correspondence with Bobrikov reveals that the Governor General's policy in Finland as welcome for Russian Tsar. The emperor only regretted that the policy against Finnish autonomy started so lately. Nicholas also promised to charge his officials promoting the propaganda of Bobrikov's policies. As a result, during the reign of Nicholas II, between Russia and Finland was formed an indivisible border, on the one side of which were Russian imperial interests, on the other side where were needs of Finland's national development. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas, who violated the promises of his predecessors to preserve the Finnish autonomy, obtained the negative image in Finnish society as law breaker of promises. The fall of Romanov's monarchy in the February Revolution opened the way for transformation of so-called united and indivisible Russian Empire to voluntary union of equal peoples based on federal model of state government. The fate of revolution's democratic gains depended on the success of this transformation. The national questions turned out to be no less urgent than the issues of power, land, and peace. And one of the fundamental components of that questions was the problem of relations between Finland and Russia in the nearest future, state legal status of the Grand Duchy of Finland within the Russian state. It should be pointed out that the February Revolution did not signify any essential change in the Russian foreign policy. The provisional government continued the war, and in this context, maintaining control over the strategically important Finland had great significance. On the whole, the provisional government pursued the following goals in its Finnish policy. First, to ensure the loyalty of Finnish society towards a new democratic Russia, to involve the Finnish elite in active cooperation with the central government in Petrograd, to force Finland to refuse secret contacts with Germany, and to attract Finnish volunteers to serve in the Russian army. One of the leaders of the Finnish opposition, professor of Helsinki University, Edward Hjelt, gave an interesting conversation in his diaries with the new commander of the Baltic fleet, Admiral Maximov. Maximov remarked that as a sign of thanks for the freedoms it had been granted, Finland should demonstrate its solidarity with Russia by offering volunteers for the army. In Maximov's opinion, the sense of duty should oblige Finland to join the war on the side of Russia. Indeed, these first steps of the new Russian government encouraged attractiveness of a new democratic Russian power in Finnish society. The provisional government effectively restored Finland's autonomy, which was seriously damaged by the policy of Tsar Nicholas II. The effective restoration of the Grand Duchy's autonomy, in fact, had generated a surge of sympathy for the new democratic Russia among the majority of Finnish citizens and politicians. For example, in a speech in March 1917, Danielson Kalmari, the spiritual leader of the bourgeois conservative party, Old Finns, compared the February Revolution to the French Revolution of 1789. He noted that Eastern powers had now entered an important historical period through which the Western powers had passed after the French Revolution. Basically, the most representatives of the bourgeois parties considered it essential to conduct a policy of cooperation with the provisional government. The further broadening of the Grand Duchy autonomy in the framework of the Russian state appeared to be reliable by constitutional means through a constructive dialogue with the provisional government. In spring of 1917, in Finnish society, two questions were discussed in detail: the future state legal status of the Grand Duchy Finland and mechanisms of relationship with central authorities in Petrograd. Above all, it had to be determined the main question, the question of supreme authority. After the February Revolution, the figure of the emperor who united Russia and Finland disappeared. It should be decided to whom supreme power over Finland had passed after the breakdown of the Romanov monarchy, who had the right to assume the power of monarch or Grand Duke in Finland, where the three institutions pretended on the rights of Russian Emperor in Finland. The first was the provisional government. It considered itself to be the heir of the supreme rights of Finland and had previously belonged to the Russian Emperor. But many Finnish politicians and lawyers did not agree with this position. As the authority of the provisional government constantly fell in Finland, the number of those who doubted the rights of the provisional government to supreme power in Finland was growing. In Finland, two forces claimed on the rights of the Russian monarch. The first was the Finnish government Senate, the second was the Finnish parliament. Each of the branches of power dreamed to appropriate the rights of the Russian emperor in Finland. Each of the branches of power also dreamed to get support from the Russian government. On the end of March, the Finnish government Senate established special commission, a constitutional committee, commission of basic laws in Russian documents. The head of this committee was Karl Stolberg, who will become Finland's first president in the future. The activities of Stolberg Committee, and especially its negotiations with the provisional government, are insufficiently illuminated in historical discourse, except for the fundamental Osmo Jusila's book about the Grand Duchy of Finland. The task of the committee was the preparation of two drafts. The first was the form of government or constitution of Finland. The second was the draft of the agreement between Finland and Russia about state legal status Finland in Russian state. The most important was the second draft, which demarcated the power in Finland between Russian central and Finnish local governments. The Constitutional Committee worked out a draft agreement, according to which substantial part of the prerogatives previously belonging to the Russian emperor, such as the power to convene and disband the parliament and the approval of Finnish laws, were transferred to the Finnish government, Finnish Senate. The Senate would become the focus of real power in the duchy. The provisional government would retain the prerogative of appointing of highest officials in Finland, as well as deciding issues of defense and foreign policy. In April, this proposal was sent to Petrograd, where in the course of the negotiation with the provisional government, it was rejected. I'd like to point out that in spring of 1917, Finnish ruling elite, which was very cautious, rather conservative in its projects, did not raise the questions of complete Finland's independence, secessions from the empire as independent state. On the contrary, Finnish ruling elite was interested in remaining in the Russian state, but to conclude with the central authorities such an agreement where the powers of the central government and the regional Finnish authorities would be clearly indicated. The Finnish elite distrusted to provisional government, dreaming to legally formalize the relationships between Helsinki and Petrograd in special agreement. As the materials of general meetings between the Constitutional Committee and Committee of Law of Provisional Government demonstrated that Finnish ruling elite was afraid the Russian democracy more than Tsarism. This is particularly true of the speeches of Stolberg, Vrede, and especially Danielson Kalmari during their meetings with Russian members of Committee of Law of Provisional Government. For example, Danielson Kalmari followed some kind of position of Snellman, the Russian emperor, as a Grand Duke of Finland was generally considered as a good man, but Russian society was not so good, rather bad, and had not enough democracy. Another member of the Constitutional Committee, Baron Vrede, also frankly expressed his reason why the supreme authority, except for foreign policy and defense, should be given to the Finnish government. He feared that in Russia, after the fall of the monarchy, nationalists could come to power. If earlier autocratic monarchs, as a rule, restrained nationalistic aspirations, democratic republic and the provisional government had not enough power to stop Russian nationalism. That is why Finland needed agreement with Russia about mutual legal relations to preserve internal independence. The Finnish elite feared Russian democracy more than Tsarism. They worked with the monarchy and knew what to expect of it. But Russian democracy was a completely new and unknown phenomenon. One of the reasons why the Finnish government dreamed to assume the rights of emperor in Finland was its conflict with Finnish social democrats, who had the majority in the Finnish parliament. So the third pretender on the rights of Russian monarch in Finland was the Finnish parliament. Most seats in Finnish parliaments belonged to the Social Democrats. It was an interesting fact in history when the Russian Empire, which was considered a so-called prison of people in wartime, allowed to the election to the Finnish parliament on the basis of the most democratic electoral system in the world. As a result of this election, was at first time in history that in 1916 the Social Democrats had gained an absolute majority in the parliament. And the this Oskar Takoi was also selected chairman of the Finnish government Senate. In April, the Finnish parliament began its work. The Russian State Archive in St. Petersburg contains quite interesting document, an unofficial appeal. The prominent as this Edward Gulin, Kurt Takosinin, and Karl Wick, they formulated the basic principles of social democratic variant of a stage agreement between Finland and Russia. In its capacity as an independent state, Finland simultaneously was to form an undissoluble union with Russia. Questions of foreign policy would be decided by Russia, but elements of even that policy directly concerning Finland would go into effect only after the approval by its parliament. Further, Finland would receive complete independence in internal affairs and an organ of supreme power independent of the empire. The appeal was secret and was decided to test the voters for a possible agreement with the Russian government. Moreover, its authors were open to the possibility of reconsidering certain of the draft's points, anticipating the central authorities' likely objection that signing such an agreement would result in Finland's practical independence. Social Democrats notes Finland is too small to ignore the interests of wishes of Russian state power, and they were ready to dialogue with Russian provisional government. Meanwhile, in early July, in Petrograd, yet another political crisis broke out, and the authority of the provisional government was left hanging by a thread. In this context, in July 18, the Finnish parliament approved a law of supreme power by which the prerogative previously belonged to Russian monarch, with the exception of foreign policy and military policy, were given to the parliament. And on July 31, the provisional government dissolved this Finnish Sejm. This was, it seems, one of the serious mistakes. Finnish parliament demanded, in fact, the broadest internal autonomy from Finland, but not separation from Russia. Russia's strategic interests were not touched by the law on power. Besides that, on the examples of dispersal of the Finnish parliament, Finnish contemporaries saw a contrast in the politics of Russian democracy and the Tsarist autocracy. Such an authoritarian Tsarist government, so hated by many Finns in wartime conditions, conducted elections to the Finnish parliament, while the so-called democratic provisional government dissolved it. Russian democracy, in view of many Finns, became more and more dangerous. Some Finnish politicians revised their view on the February Revolution. They began considering February events in Russia as a putsch. Thereby, they denied the legitimacy of the provisional government. With the dissolution of the Sejm, a new and complicated stage in Finland, internal political development began. Not only did the Social Democrats demand complete internal independence for Finland, but practically all bourgeois parties supported this as well. In October 1917, negotiations between Helsinki and Petrograd continued. Stolberg's constitutional committee prepared two projects. According to the second project, Finland remained united with Russia, but has its own constitution and government, independent from the legislative and governmental authorities of Russia. Foreign policy will remain in Russia's hand, but Finnish delegates would participate in whose international conferences that touched on Finland's interest. Russian military forces would remain in the Grand Duchy until the creation of the own army. In November, in 2nd and 3rd November, a joint meetings were held between the Finnish Constitutional Committee and Russian Committee of Law by the provisional government. The chairman of this meeting was Paasikivi, who knew Russian well. There was an aspiration of both sides to find a compromise, to find a positive result that would satisfy both, and friendly atmosphere prevailed at the meetings. The main discussions were held around broad range of power of so-called ruler as president and defense and foreign issues. But the provisional government surprisingly, without any bureaucratic delays, approved the proposal to pass the two projects, Constitution of Finland and agreement about state legal status, for consideration of the Finnish parliament. But compromise was found too late. In November 17, the Bolsheviks came to power in Petrograd. The projects of Russian-Finnish agreement and form of government which legally fixed the relationships between Russia and Finland, remained unrealized. At the same time, the basic ideas of the form of government prepared by Stolberg's committee were borrowed by the drafters of the first constitution of independent Finland, adopted in 1919. In conclusion, it should be pointed out that after the February Revolution, the mechanism of power holding of the Russian Empire together were destroyed, and the framework on which the empire had been constructed was eliminated. As a result, the national regions experienced a vacuum of power that threatened catastrophe. The Finnish political elite was simply left with no alternative but to fill that vacuum and to assume some of prerogatives of the central authorities. The provisional government was linking their hopes with the possibility of preserving the empire in its new democratic version. It seems that the democratization of society itself resolves all the problems with the oppression in the multinational state, including the national issue with the strengthening of democracy. But Russian democracy, unable to stop the chaos inside the country, had become considered by the Finnish elite as a greater threat than Russian Tsarism. The Finnish society rightly did not trust the ability of provisional government to stop the left and right extreme radicals. Finally, it can say that for world history, the formation of a nation and then the formation of independent state is a rare exception for the rule than the rule. It violates the common logic of the development of events. States have created nations for themselves and not vice versa. Meanwhile, Finland was very worthily passed his way. Inclusion of several Swedish eastern provinces in the Russian Empire by the Friedrichshain Treaty of 1809 created conditions for the formation of the Finnish identity and for the creation of political nation. For more than 100 Russian imperial period, Finland earned the right to independence through hard work in economics, development of civil society, parliament system, due to the spiritual work Finnish intellectuals elite, and at the time when history gave the small country of a chance to become an independent state, the Finnish elite skillfully took advantage of this chance. Paljon kiitoksia.
Thank you very much for this detailed description of Finnish-Russian relations. I think, because we have to go further, but I think there is time for one brief question if somebody wants to ask something, please.
I would give you just two small information. The first one is the dissolution of the Finnish autonomy under the ministers of Barbakov. The Duma had a strong protest against this project, and including, interesting enough, the 5 Muslim deputies of the empire, only 5 Muslim, 3 of them from Crimea, 2 from Kazan, Tatarstan. And the champion of these speeches are Professor Sadri Maksudi Arsal, later president of Tatarstan Republic in 18, and deputy to the Turkish parliament in 1923. The name is clear. The attitude of Kerensky is quite interesting. In 1963, there was a meeting of all Russian Congress in Munich, of course, the opposition leaders of the former Russia, former Soviet Union. They invited also Kerensky to Tutsik, the old man, and there they asked him after the fall of communism, which is a very near future, they said, what's your plan and project for these non-Russian peoples? What kind of independence? He said, Russia Yedinaya, Russia Yedinaya, Russia is indivisible, so I don't have to talk here with you, though the project did not change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we go further. Margus Laidre, ambassador of Estonia in Finland, is our second speaker. Besides his impressive career as a diplomat, Laidre is also a renowned historian with focus on early modern Northern European history. But today he will talk about the independence process of Estonia in the aftermath of the First World War. So please.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the American poet Robert Greeley, who has also briefly stayed here in Finland, has written a line. Have we told you all you thought to know? And this is exactly how I feel, standing in front of this distinguished audience, thinking, what on earth I am doing here? Can I really contribute with something you already don't know? Secondly, I was asked if I also have a PowerPoint, but the only possible power, unfortunately, you can find within myself, and what about the point? It still remains to be seen. So, off we go. The English novelist and poet Thomas Hardy has written that though a good deal is too strange to be believed, nothing is too strange to have happened. And this very much applies to Estonian history as well. Estonians have had to deal with shortages for most of their history, from a shortage of freedom to a shortage of sunlight. But in one sense, we have been a land of plenty, because there has never been a shortage of history. Estonians have mostly been observers or bystanders in our own history, yet having the memory of an elephant, never forgetting their forebears. The century since the end of the Napoleonic Wars had been the most peaceful era Europe had known since the fall of the Roman Empire. In the first years of the 20th century, Europe believed it was marching to a golden, happy, and prosperous future. People became used to peace. Most Europeans thought that a global war was impossible, an improbable and ineffective way of resolving disputes. But instead, complex of personalities and rivalries, colonialism and ethnic nationalism, and shifting alliances helped to bring about the failure of the long peace and the outbreak of a war that transformed Europe and the world. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria ignited the crisis the moves and countermoves that would lead to general European war, the Great Black Tornado, as Theodore Roosevelt called it. 65 million men served in the conflict. Roughly 10 million of them died and 20 million were wounded. One gruesome reminder of the sacrifices of the generation was the fact that this was one of the first times in conflict whereby more men had died in battle than to disease, which had been the main cause of deaths in most previous wars. I think that the war was anticipated by all major powers. Some of them were only by accident or otherwise clever enough to disguise their real intentions, or had a greater patience in order not to strike first. If not the shooting in Sarajevo, another pretext would have been found for sure. The powder keg was ready to be blown up. It was only a matter of when and where. Margaret Macmillan, in her splendid The War That Ended Peace, concludes, I quote, "It was Europe and the world's tragedy, in retrospect, that none of the key players in 1914, the great and imaginative leaders who had the courage to stand out against the pressure building up for war." End of quote. The war was one of history's great turning points, the beginning of what the Hungarian historian Ivan Berend and after him Erich Hobsbawm described as a short 20th century, which, as we all know, ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It brought down 4 European empires and weakened the colonial powers that ended on the winning side, Britain and France. It spawned communism and fascism and changed relations between governments and peoples. The end of war transformed the political geography of Europe and the Middle East. Many new nation-states were born, including Finland, Latvia, Czechoslovakia, and my own Estonia, as independent countries for the first time in history, or reappeared after the long absence as Poland and Lithuania. Here one can ask a theoretical and slightly provocative question. Would this have happened even without the World War I? Perhaps yes, but it's impossible to deny that the war certainly accelerated this process. While Estonia territory was not involved in the fighting of the First World War until 1918, Estonia was obviously affected by the conflict from an early stage. While it was feared that German victory would involve a process of Germanification, there was no enthusiasm for fighting for the Tsar if Russification was to be the result of Russian victory. The Estonian economy was disrupted. Estonia became a base area for operations in Latvia, and many refugees from Latvia arrived in Estonia. About 100,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Tsarist army, and about 10,000 of them were killed. The Russians moved quickly to limit the influence of the Baltic Germans, but as before, it was Russians that replaced Germans in the administration, not Estonians. German ideas for a joint Estonian-German provincial council involving concessions to the Estonians were not widely supported. The Northern Baltic Committee, based in Tartu, but with branches all over Estonia, was formed as a voluntary organization. It sought to help refugees, support the Russian army, and help meet economic needs of Estonia, but it was also active in spreading Estonian nationalist ideas. February Revolution in Russia resulted in the abdiction of the Tsar and the formation of the provisional government. The unrest in Russia was mirrored by unrest in Estonia, particularly amongst the Russian population. The provisional government appointed Jaan Poska an Estonian lawyer and the mayor of Tallinn as their governor general. Demands for Estonian autonomy within Russia reached a climax with a demonstration by 40,000 Estonians, 12,000 of them armed soldiers, in Petrograd on 26th of March 1917. At the end of March, the provisional government granted autonomy within a new Estonian province, including Estonian-speaking northern Livonia, but excluding both the Narva and the Setu areas in southeast. Elections to the new provincial council were held in May 1917, and the council assembled for the first time in July, when government was elected. Tensions between Tallinn and Petrograd grew. The replacement of Russians and the Russian language by Estonians and the Estonian language in the new administration was much resented by the previous office holders. The attempts of the new administration to limit the influence of the Bolshevik Soviets that had formed in Estonia were opposed by many workers. Finally, the formation of all Estonian military units amidst the turmoil of the collapse of the Tsarist Russian army, although supported by the provisional government, was opposed within the army itself. Essentially, the provisional government in Petrograd was powerless to control events, and the main opposition to the new Estonian provincial government came from Estonian Bolsheviks. In Tallinn, the Bolsheviks seized power on 26th of October 1917, as soon as they had news of the success of the revolution in Petrograd. Viktor Kingissepp, a vice chairman of the Bolshevik Estonian Revolutionary War Committee, replaced Jan Poska. The ousted provincial government continued to meet illegally, and at the end of 1917 decided to seek independence for Estonia and recognition from Western countries. Bolshevik elections planned for January 1918 were cancelled when it became clear that the Bolsheviks would not achieve an absolute majority, and the Bolshevik rule became increasingly dictatorial. The Estonian National Army units posed a problem for the Bolsheviks. They were combined into an Estonian division commanded by Johann Laidoner. But it was not until January 1918 that their replacement by Estonian Red Guards began. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Baltic Germans sought assistance from Germany. The Bolsheviks, in response, began to deport the Baltic Germans. This program of deportations lent weight to the German decision to resume the offensive against Russia following the breakdown of the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk. As has already related, the German occupied Estonia during Operation Faustschlag from 18 February to 4th March 1918. The Germans occupied Tallinn on 25th of February, but on the previous day, on 24th of February, the provisional government had declared Estonia independence. And 24th of February has celebrated since then as the birth of Estonian independence. The United Kingdom, France and Italy gave de facto recognition to Estonia in May 1918. In accordance with the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, while the Bolsheviks ceded sovereignty of the Estonian islands, they retained jurisdiction in Livonia and Estonia, although German troops were to be stationed here for security. The Germans had no wish to encourage the independence in the form desired by Estonians. Konstantin Päts, who had been declared prime minister, was imprisoned. Germans were reinstated in all positions of high office. Political parties were banned, and strict censorship was instituted. On 5th of November 1918, the Baltic Duchy was proclaimed in Riga. Formally independent, the Baltic Duchy included both Estonia and Latvia and was intended to perpetuate German economic domination of the area in a close political relationship with Germany. On 11th of November, the armistice brought the First World War to an end in the West, at the same time as economic collapse of the social turmoil swept Germany. The Provisional Government of Estonia resumed its activities on the very same day. On 13th of November, Soviet Russia annulled the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and prepared for offensive action in the Baltic region. On 22nd November, Soviet forces attacked Narva, but met stiff German resistance and withdrew. However, a couple of days later, the Germans withdrew from Pskov, and the Soviet forces followed in their wake, quickly capturing most of the southern Estonia. 28th of November, 1918, is formally regarded as the start of the Estonian War of Independence, when Soviet forces resumed their attack on Narva, this time against Estonian opposition. The Bolshevik Estonian Workers' Commune was declared in Narva on 29th of November. By the end of December, the Soviet forces were only 20 miles east of Tallinn. To the southeast and south, Paide, Viljandi, and Pärnu were all threatened with capture. On 6th of January 1919, the Estonians counterattacked, reinforced by the British naval presence and the Finnish volunteers, Pohjanpojad, approximately 3,500 to 4,000 men. And in addition to that, there were also small detachments of volunteers from Sweden and Denmark. In the north, on the 12th January, Rakvere was captured, and a week later, Narva fell to the forces that had been landed on the coast. In early days of February 1919, Estonia was free of Soviet forces. Throughout the period, the Estonian Bolsheviks continued to make trouble. An attempted uprising in Tallinn in December 1918 was successfully countered, and a rebellion on the island of Saaremaa in February 1919 was put down. From February to May 1919, the situation on the Narva front remained static, although Soviet artillery fire destroyed much of the town Narva. To the southeast, the Soviets launched a major counterattack in March. The Estonians, however, fought successfully defensive battles south and east of Võru. By mid-May, the Estonians had completely regained the initiative. In May, the Estonian army command decided to advance into Russia to secure the frontiers of Estonia, as it was said. This move required an uneasy alliance with the local White Russian forces, the Northwestern Army. While the White Russians were opposed to the Soviets, they were also opposed to the Estonian independence. Initially, the offensive fared well. Pskov in the south was captured, as were Jamburg, Gdov, and Luga to the north. The White Russian forces, supported by small British detachments, advanced to within a few miles of Petrograd. In April 1919, the Latvian provisional government had been ousted in a coup d'etat by a broad German government backed by the Landeswehr that preferred to turn north against the Estonians rather than east against the Soviet forces. In a fierce battle lasting 4 days, the Estonians defeated Landeswehr, and the date on which the town Cesis or Volmar was recaptured on 23rd of June 1919 has since been celebrated in Estonia as a victory day. Once again, in October 1919, Latvians sought Estonian help for the defense of Riga. In late August, the Estonians were offered peace talks by the Soviets, and these took place in September in Pskov. No agreement was reached, partly as a result of Allied pressure to continue fighting the Soviets, But the talks did demonstrate that the Russians no longer regarded the conflict as a civil war, but as one between two sovereign states. In October, the White Russian Northwestern Army launched an attack on Petrograd. This failed, and the Northwestern Army collapsed. By mid-November, Soviet forces were once again threatening Narva. The Estonians disarmed the Northwestern Army as it retreated into Estonia. But many of its members joined the Estonian forces defending Narva. At the start of December, the peace talks recommenced in Tartu. To strengthen their negotiating position, the Soviets mounted heavy attacks on Narva. In the middle of the month, the Soviet forces managed to create a bridgehead and threatened to surround the town. In very heavy fighting, the Estonians managed to restore the situation. With the defeat of the attack on Petrograd, the Allies had lost hope of defeating the Soviets and no longer opposed peace talks. On 31st of December 1919, an armistice was agreed, which came into effect on 3rd of January 1920. During peace negotiations which followed the border between Russia and Estonia was agreed, and the Treaty of Tartu was signed on 2nd of February 1920. The independent Estonia was born. And as a postscriptum, the price for the freedom in cost of human lives for Estonia was about 2,300 men killed and about 13,800 wounded. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting description of the process and also wonderful timing. And now I would suggest that we continue with the presentation of Professor Alapuro, and then after his presentation we might have a little bit time for discussion and questions, because these three first presentations are actually belong together, so to say, and then we go further to the British Empire. So now I would like to introduce Professor Emeritus Risto Alapuro from the University of Helsinki. He is one of the most renowned social scientists in Finland, and he's also internationally acknowledged, particularly for his work State and Revolution in Finland from 1988. And a new edition will be hopefully published in near future. So welcome, Risto.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the first steps of the Finnish independence were marked by a civil war, or a abortive revolution, that broke out in January 1918, only a month and a half after the Declaration of Independence. In hoping to make understandable these two events and the road to them, I will focus on the specific way domestic and non-domestic, or internal and external developments were linked to each other in that process. And then I will make one or two comparative remarks, if I have the time, remarks in which I will try to put the Finnish conflict in a broader context. As the other minority regions of the Russian Empire in the Grand Duchy of Finland, the 1917 February Revolution in Russia led to the removal of wartime restrictions. Political life was reactivated in March, and the coalition government, or the economic department of the Senate, was formed, reflecting the relative strength of political parties in parliament, which was based on universal suffrage for men and women. The Social Democrats had 6 ministers out of 12, including the post of prime minister, in accordance with their majority in parliament, 103 seats out of 200. For the first time in any country, the socialist became the head of government. The party was not revolutionary from any serious comparative perspective, but rather resembled the social democratic parties in the Scandinavian countries. The government took over the reins at a difficult moment. On the one hand, expectations of reforms ran high after the forced political standstill of the previous years. On the other hand, the economic and social situation was deteriorating. The food situation worsened, unemployment increased, and inflation accelerated. Yet, despite the mounting expectations and social and economic problems, cooperation between socialists and bourgeois ministers remained good well into the summer of 1917. The socialists had 3 big reforms they wanted to advance: an 8-hour workday, the democratization of local government, and the enfranchisement of the crofters. All these reforms went ahead in parliament. At the same time, extra-parliamentary collective action was taken, most notably in the form of strikes. This began in the industrial sector in April and spread to agriculture in May and June. The workers also exerted pressure on local government to back the communal reforms. From the perspective of the Social Democratic Party, which shared political power for the first time, the wave of popular mobilization was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, in order to push the reforms through in an orderly manner with the bourgeois parties, the socialists had to be able to control this popular movement. On the other hand, the party could not possibly take a consistently negative stand on mobilization when the masses, the backbone of its support, presented their demands to the state. There was another factor that potentially threatened the delicate political balance. It was the issue of the maintenance of order. The established instruments of coercion, an essential part of any state machinery, were paralyzed as a consequence of the February Revolution in Russia. The situation arose not only because the only armed forces, the Russian troops stationed in Finland, were disabled by the February Revolution, but also and above all because of the disintegration of the Finnish police force. The police had been Russified, in quotes, in the previous years of Russian rule. And now policemen and rural police officials were commonly forced to resign. In the short term, they could not be replaced for purely practical reasons by new quote, non-Russified policemen and rural police officials. Instead, in March and April 1917, they were replaced by local militias. The status of these militias as public or semi-public organizations was ambiguous. In several cases, communal militias overlapped with specific worker militias. And therefore, the borderline between public and private maintenance of order was bound to be obscured. As important was that the restoration of the regular maintenance of order was impossible without the support of the Social Democrats, because they were majority in the parliament, in government. And this situation was an asset for Social Democrats, provided that the militias could be kept under control. In the spring, this did not appear too difficult despite the wave of organization and mobilization among the masses. On the other hand, this situation also meant that every purely bourgeois attempt to restore the regular arrangements for maintaining order were bound to lead to private organization. That is, to organization outside the governmental apparatus. And indeed, bourgeois, quote, in quotes, anti-hooliganism organizations willing to, quote, restore internal order began to appear in the summer. Yet, for the most part, they existed only on paper until August. In addition to the ambiguity over the issue of order, there was another issue, another ambiguity, the question of imperial prerogatives presented in Professor Novikova's presentation. Should their exercise be transferred to the Finnish government, or rather in which way and to what degree should their exercise be transferred to the Finnish government in the new situation after the collapse of the Russian autocracy? Coupled with the issue of order, this question was to pit the socialists and the bourgeois groups against each other in a way that was to provide the single most important step toward a situation of dual power, that is, toward the formation of two exclusive polities claiming sovereignty over the territory of Finland. The Social Democrats' view of the transfer of imperial prerogatives included the extension of the Finnish autonomy and, if possible, full independence. In mid-July, they pushed through a so-called law on authority, law on supreme power in Professor Novikova's talk, which proclaimed full internal autonomy for Finland and the transfer of imperial prerogatives to the Finnish parliament. Many bourgeois representatives had doubts about the law, but in its final reading, most of them also backed it, and it was passed. The socialists envisioned that they would form a purely social democratic government after the approval of the law, thanks to their parliamentary majority. But this never occurred. The Russian provisional government refused to approve the law, dissolved parliament, and ordered new elections in Finland. Now all the bourgeois deputies sided with the provisional government and were ready for the dissolution of parliament and the new elections. By the same token, the 8-hour workday and local government acts, which had already gone through parliamentary readings, were left unconfirmed. The Social Democrats found the reaction of the bourgeois parties totally unacceptable, and they were never to regard the new elections as legal, even though, in practice, they were forced to adapt to the new situation. The ministers left the government, and the remaining purely bourgeois government took as its first objective the creation of, I quote, a powerful security force for the country. These efforts remained largely ineffective, however. One reason was that the government feared that the radicalized Russian soldiers in the country would intervene if the government dissolved the worker militias and re-established the regular police. By the way, this was probably the most important contribution of the Russian troops to the developments in Finland in 1917. What happened instead was that private bourgeois organizations for restoring internal order mushroomed. By the end of September, there were considerably more bourgeois guards than worker militias or guards. In the elections held at the beginning of October, the Social Democrats lost their majority in parliament, and at the same time, the formation of the worker guards advanced rapidly, although this process had begun already after the repeal of the law on authority in July, and particularly with the proliferation of the bourgeois guards in August and September. In late October, the party acquiesced to the formation of a nationwide armed workers organization, mainly because the establishment of a central organization seemed the only way of controlling burgeoning popular mobilization. Moreover, it was nourished by the worsening food shortage. On 1st November, the Social Democrats issued, under strong popular pressure, a manifesto stating that the dissolution of parliament had been illegal and demanding, among other things, the election of a constituent assembly and the dissolution of the bourgeois civil guards. But because the bourgeois parties stood firm against these demands, the party leadership was forced to consent to general strike. By the same token, it also had to face the problem of the seizure of power. In terms of the control of everyday activities, the strike was enormously successful. However, very soon, the Social Democratic Party took a clear stand against the seizure of power. It did its utmost to prevent the strike from becoming a full-scale revolution. On the fifth day, the strike was called off, largely because the party had no real vision of what should be done with the power it had obtained. On the bourgeois side, the general strike caused them to close ranks more effectively than anything else. Now the most important tasks of the government were identified as, I quote, the securing of Finland's political independence, unquote, and the establishment of a strong force for the maintenance of order. These two tasks, independence and order, were closely related to each other. The former objective, independence, was brought to the fore by the October Revolution in Russia. In mid-November, exactly almost 100 years ago, in the mid-November, in the middle of the general strike, Parliament assumed the exercise of sovereign powers in the country. Now, supported by all parties, independence was declared on 6 December under the shadow of internal disorder and was recognized by the Bolshevik government 3 weeks later. As to the restoration of internal order, at the government's disposal were the bourgeois civil guards, which expanded considerably after the general strike, and part of the Finnish Jäger battalion. This unit consisted of Finnish volunteers who had fought on Germany's eastern front against Russia and were supposed to act to separate Finland from Russia with German help. Finally, on 9th January 1918, the government sought and a few days later received authorization from Parliament for the creation of a strong security force. This occurred despite fierce opposition from the Social Democrats. The last step leading to the war was taken on 25th January when the civil guards were declared government troops. A few days later, the hostilities began. The co-opting of the civil guards can be seen as an operation in which the state apparatus, put on the defensive, co-opted one of the two class-based organizations that had formed in civil society during the summer and autumn. After the general strike, it was perfectly clear that the bourgeois groups were prepared to restore the monopoly on physical force by calling on the civil guards to suppress the worker security guards. In the long term, it was inconceivable that the country would have two competing polities in the same territory. On the other hand, it was just as clear that the worker movement would not voluntarily comply and dissolve the alternative polity or power center, consisting not only of the Social Democratic Party and the trade union organization, but also the National Worker Security Guard. Radical or revolutionary tendencies had been gaining ground and became predominant in mid-January when the government received authorization to create a strong security force. After encounters with the bourgeois guards in several localities, and after the civil guards gained official status as governmental troops, it was decided with great reluctance to launch the revolution on 27th January. It was described as having, I quote, a defensive character. In a sense, the worker movement embarked upon a revolution, whereas the bourgeois groups performed a coup d'etat. The worker movement entered into a revolution in the sense that it challenged the government in office and the prevailing political order more generally. The bourgeois groups performed a coup d'etat in the sense that they were willing to monopolize power by expelling the worker movement from the position it had gained in the previous year in the framework of the prevailing political system. The revolution was crushed 3 months later and was followed by a terrible wave of executions and deaths in prison camps. How should then the road to the Finnish civil war or attempt revolution be assessed, and how should the Declaration of Independence be understood from the perspective of 1917? The question is, how did Finnish dependence on Russia or the dynamics between internal and external developments affect the character of the Finnish conflict? Here, the key issue concerns the opportunities the Russian crisis offered. To the bourgeois groups and the socialists, and the contribution of these opportunities to the growth and culmination of the conflict between the two parties. The two developments I have sketched seem crucial, I think. On the one hand, the February Revolution in Russia paralyzed the established system of order in Finland. This offered an extra dimension to the social democratic newcomers' exercise of governmental power. They were participants in the maintenance of order, and a return to, quote, normality could not occur without their support. On the other hand, the bourgeois groups were able to force the socialists out of political power with the help of the provisional government of Russia, by siding with it in the conflict over the rejection of the law on authority. The precise legality or illegality of these developments is of secondary importance. What is essential is that both the socialists and the bourgeois groups utilized the state's prevailing ambiguities and weaknesses in the spring and the summer of 1917. The two sets of developments helped pave the way for an escalation of the struggle between the social classes later in the autumn, including more and more systematic attempts to find arms on both sides. Food scarcity and other social problems played a role, but that role cannot be understood without recognizing the fragilities in the workings of the state. The Declaration of Independence, which of course does not equate to actually gaining independence, should be seen in the context of this power struggle. Independence was declared on 6 December 1917 in a situation where the Bolsheviks had seized power in Petrograd and where the bourgeois leaders wanted to exploit Germany's anti-Bolshevik feelings in order to compel the Bolsheviks to recognize Finnish independence and withdraw remaining Russian troops from the country. Only then would the government be free to restore internal order. It is highly symptomatic that at the moment of its declaration, independence was in no way celebrated. The shadow of the internal conflict fell dark across this presumably solemn act. Finally, a few comparative remarks, first about Estonia and then about Czechs, if I have time. About Estonia anyway, something. Estonia, which had existed as a separate political administrative entity since April 1917, as we heard Dr. Laidre's speech, Estonia also went through a revolution or a revolutionary situation as a part of the crisis in the Russian Empire. Nevertheless, unlike Finland, the process there advanced in a way which is familiar from many other revolutionary processes, including the Russian Revolution as a whole, and which also is established in different theories of revolution. One of the best known of these theories is Charles Tilly's model of the proximate causes of revolutionary situations. In this model, he lays out an idealized revolutionary sequence, which includes the gradual mobilization of contenders, then a rapid increase in their number, and finally the incapacity of the government to suppress the rival coalition. This may seem trivial or self-evident, but very importantly, it stresses the inability of the government to put down the rebels. It stresses the decisive role of the loss of control over the instruments of violence, that is, over the army and the police, as a final stage leading to a revolutionary situation. If we focus on this decisive stage of the revolutionary process, we see a big difference in the way it unfolded in Estonia and Finland. First, in the summer of 1917, in Estonia, there existed, unlike Finland, a small number of domestic Estonian troops and a new police force that replaced the Tsarist police. However, as a part of a more general radicalization, the local Bolsheviks gained control of these Estonian national troops in September and early October, a couple of months after these troops had been created. The process was completed in the elections to the Russian Constituent Assembly 2 weeks after the October Revolution, in which the Bolsheviks gained 40% of the vote and became by far the largest party in Estonia. In sum, the developments in Estonia, as in Russia, followed the idealized revolutionary sequence. First, the mobilization of radical challenges in the newly founded Estonia in the spring, then the rapid increase in their number in the summer, and finally the inability of the local institutions to suppress the revolutionaries, thanks to the Bolsheviks' capacity to seize power as a part of their more general domination of the population. In Finland, by contrast, the inability of the government to suppress the contenders or a rival coalition was the first stage of the revolutionary process, not the final one. The loss of control over the instruments of violence, the army and the police, was the starting point, not the final point. The state would have been unable to suppress a revolutionary contender if only one had existed. In short, what is peculiar to the Finnish revolution is that the road to revolution began with the government's inability to suppress an eventual revolutionary contender, and that such a contender only appeared gradually as a result of a laborious process of mobilization. The crucial factor was the paralysis or the loss of control over the means of violence as a consequence of the crisis in Russia on the one hand, and the strong position of the domestic worker movement at the outset of the crisis on the other. In this interpretation, the Social Democrats were essentially trying to maintain power and the advantages they had gained within the political system by the middle of 1917. Thus, rather than actively seizing power, they were striving to counter the bourgeoisie's attempt to recapture it. What mattered most was first the worker movement's strong grip on state power, which lacked its own coercive apparatus, and then the contested loss of this control. No revolutionary party was needed for the revolutionary situation to finally break out. Ultimately, the Finnish Civil War is a manifestation of Finland's position at the interface of East and West. The conflict was unleashed by a combination of the Eastern-style dependence of a minority region on an empire, Russia, and the strong presence of a non-revolutionary worker movement developed on the basis of Western or Swedish structures and institutions. And finally, very shortly, about Czechs as a national minority in the Habsburg Empire. There, a social democratic party existed, a party which was comparable to its Finnish counterpart. However, it did not attempt at a revolution as a consequence of a power vacuum in the mother empire. Instead, it became instrumental in the national struggle. Here, the crucial difference seems to lie in the distinctiveness of the political entities involved. Finland was a fully fledged polity, a state. Finnish socialists had a position in this polity, and they were ready to defend that position, which finally led them into an abortive revolution. By contrast, the task faced by Czech socialists was not a struggle in an existing polity, but the creation of a new polity or a state. A struggle, and in this struggle, in the words of a Czech historian, I quote, "The working people became the main force of the Czech national liberation struggle." Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also for the end of your talk, because you in a very nice way also summarized the effects the breakdown of the Russian Empire, so in a way combine the three first presentations. But now we have some minutes for questions or comments to all these three presentations. Jussi Nuorteva, please.
Maybe I can use this microphone. I would like to bring the Finnish independence to the international connection of the time of the First World War, because when we see, of course, that was in the context of the losses of the Russian troops in the First World War that made the revolution possible in Russia. And for Finland, it was at that time seen very much also as an internal question of Russia, so that it was not seen as something that is related to the political situation between the great powers in Europe. And that is reflected when we look at the independence as it was declared. It was very quickly, within the weeks, recognized by the Bolshevik government of Russia. And when we look at the other recognitions, Swedish recognition, French recognition, German recognition came during actually on the same day, and the other Nordic countries very quickly. But, for example, the British government, they were discussing recognition of the Finnish government and Finnish independence, but that wasn't given at that time because they didn't want to mix in internal affairs of the Russian government. After the Brest-Litovsk Pact, it was a totally different situation because we had the German troops coming to Finland and we had the British taking active role also in the Baltic Sea and also in the north. I would like to ask the speakers how they see, would the Finnish independence in this way had been possible after the Brest-Litovsk Pact?
Just one remark perhaps for our foreign guests. It so happens that exactly 100 years ago, last night, we had a decision for revolution for 2 hours. It was voted by the socialists by 2 votes to get the revolution, and after 2 hours it was cancelled by 1 vote. So this is very historical. And last night also the parliament decided to take the whole imperial power to parliament's hand. But it so happens also that we have still, after 100 years, a red story and white story. And Mr. Alapuro, which has heard the red story. This is a long story. It doesn't take into account the internal development, the relation between Lenin Bolsheviks and the Finnish Social Democrats, and the split inside the Social Democratic Party in July 17. And it doesn't take into account the international context. It means how Finnish independence process was related to Brest-Litovsk and Trotsky's policy. But this is a long story. We can't solve the problem now.
Yes, thank you. Now the speakers, would you like to answer to Jussi Nuorteva's question?
No.
Or Irina, Dr. Novikova.
I think it's very difficult questions. We also need to take in our attention the factor of the Brest-Litovsk negotiations between the Bolsheviki and German delegation. The Finnish questions, Finnish independence, also was discussed during Brest-Litovsk negotiations in December. And I know, using the German archives, that the questions of recognition of Finnish independence also discussed between German and Russian representatives in December. And German delegation strongly recommended to Finnish representatives to go to Petrograd, and German delegation pointed out that the Bolsheviks was the one government who could recognize Finnish independence. It was the big game between great powers, and Finland became as a part of this game. The Bolsheviks considered Finland independence, Finnish independence, as a part of world revolution. And the German considered Finnish independence as the point for pressure to the government of Bolsheviks, strategical pressure for government to Bolsheviks.
So now we continue and turn to the British Empire, where Ireland constitutes a very interesting case for comparison with Finland's independence, but we start with a more general analysis of the British Empire during and after the First World War, given by Dr. Henry Irving. And he comes from the Leeds University and is a specialist of the 20th century British history. And his research focuses on, among other topics, on the history of communication. So, welcome.
Wonderful, thank you. Is that picking up? First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the conference organisers for the invitation. It's a wonderful place to be. It's my first time in Helsinki, and I've had a really nice time so far. I've also got the very easy job because English is my first language, so I will try to do my best with the communication as I go through today. Certainly, I think I would struggle if I was doing this in Finnish. I would also just like to say thank you to Tina for the introduction. It's very fitting that we have started this conference thinking about the First World War. The First World War for Britain, as in Finland, is an incredibly important moment in 20th century history. It marks really for Britain the beginning of the modern age. So at my university, for example, our courses will often start or end in either 1914 or 1918. Our students are taught that the process leading up to the First World War is really about the emergence of modernity, whereas the years afterwards are about the sort of the modern age in its true form. The First World War also looms very large in histories of the British Empire. And if we see this as a story of expansion during the 19th century, followed by retreat during the 20th, then the First World War is the tipping point. It is a moment of change where old certainties were replaced by something far less stable. So in this talk, I'm going to try and survey some of the main challenges that were facing Britain and the British Empire at the end of the First World War. In some respects, this talk will be slightly more global than those we've heard so far. This is a talk that will deal with India, with Canada, with New Zealand, with Australia. But in other respects, the talk is actually going to be quite localized, because as an example, I'm going to be focusing on a particular event that took place in a North London suburb in the 1920s, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. Hopefully it will be of interest and will help to contextualize some of what we've heard so far. Now, I should say at the beginning that Britain ended the First World War in a remarkably strong position, or a seemingly strong position. The country was, as we've heard, on the winning side of the conflict. With the exception of Ireland, which I'm not going to say a great deal about, but which will be covered in the next talk, Britain had avoided revolution, and it was generally peaceful. And while there had been some criticism of the government and some quite important strikes, the public had mostly remained behind the war effort. There was not the same level of uncertainty that you see in Germany or in Russia at this time. The British Empire also seemed to be in a particular position of strength. I think the map here, although perhaps a little difficult to make out, does give a sense of this. This is from an atlas produced at the end of the First World War. It shows in the pink colour areas which were under British rule, and then at the bottom you have a key which tries to explain this. The key explains that the empire covered around 1/4 of the world's surface. It also accounted for around 1/4 of the world's population. This, in geographic terms, was the British Empire at its absolute height, so seemingly in a very strong position. This vast global empire had helped to sustain Britain during the course of the First World War. Around 1.2 million people from around the world, so from Australia, from Canada, from India and New Zealand, had fought alongside British troops. And the Empire's vast material resources had also helped to sustain British factories and feed British civilians. The British Empire was also an important part of British culture at this time. This was brought home to the public through literature. I'm thinking of things like Sherlock Holmes stories and others. Through cinema, through sporting competitions, cricket, football and rugby. And through events like Empire Day, which this gives a slight indication of. Empire Day was a national celebration of the empire. It was designed to encourage children to think about their links with, I suppose, other people of British descent around the world. This is a certificate that was given to one British schoolchild in 1916, encouraging them to think about their place within the world. And these activities, they were designed to foster a sense of community with British settlers living overseas. So it was with confidence that some looked to the future. In 1927, a young historian called Lester Pearson, who went on to become the Prime Minister of Canada, wrote that the 20th century was likely to see, and I quote, "the successful solution of Britain's imperial problems." This was a very optimistic vision of the next 100 years. Most British historians would now identify the First World War, as an important moment of change, however, with the 20th century becoming a period where empire became increasingly less relevant, a position where Britain found itself in a very different global role. The First World War within this story is an event which had political, economic and social consequences, which created far more uncertainty than had been the case before. This would eventually lead to the incremental dismantling of empire as Britain attempted to find a new position for itself in the world. And I'd like to just run through some of these political, economic and social consequences with you. So if I start with the political ones, the most significant political consequence of the First World War was the extension of voting rights within Britain. This extension covered all men over the age of 21 and some women over the age of 30. Britain has still had some way to go to catch up with Finland. Nevertheless, this extension of the franchise was an important recognition of the role that ordinary people and British citizens had played during the First World War. This was a recognition of their efforts, and it symbolised for Britain the beginning of a new period of mass democracy. The change didn't immediately impact the balance of power. So in 1918, only a month after the armistice with Germany, there was a general election. And this returned a comfortable majority for the ruling coalition led by the Prime Minister David Lloyd George. However, in time, the extension of voting rights led to a shift in power that upset pre-war certainties. And it can be argued that during the 1920s and the 1930s, British public opinion actually became more insular. It became more focused on domestic issues at the expense of foreign policy. And this increasing focus on conditions at home meant that the British Empire was just one of many policies that the government had to face. and it was increasingly seen as a choice of policy rather than an inevitable part of British identity. Now, this rethinking of empire was encouraged further by the economic situation. I'm just going to take you back to the map because this becomes important in a moment. So in 1918, 41% of British trade was conducted with the empire, and 86% of British foreign investment happened in its overseas territories. However, Britain's ability to sustain this had been shaken by the First World War. The conflict cost the British government around $35 billion US, and it turned Britain from the world's leading creditor into one of its leading debtors. Britain still has First World War debt. There was such an amount of money that was borrowed to sustain the war effort. This also saw increased competition from the United States and Japan, which drove down British income. And this new economic reality encouraged policymakers to reconsider Britain's world role. Now, at the beginning of the 1920s, there was a hope that this empire could become economically important, that it could be made profitable. Take the example of food. 80% of British food was imported, and it was imported from around the world. British policymakers hoped that by bringing that trade from within the empire, it would then allow those imperial possessions to in turn trade with Britain, becoming a self-sustaining and self-beneficial, mutually beneficial economic unit. And this idea of the empire as a self-supporting economic unit was central to developments after the First World War, with British consumers encouraged to become, I quote, shoppers of empire. Yet the more closely that British policymakers considered the empire, the more obviously incoherent it seemed. Territories were administered in a variety of different ways. They were at very different stages of development, and they had unbelievably varied economies. Britain's ability to invest in its overseas territories had also been damaged by its large war debts. So in 1913, foreign investment had accounted for about 8% of GDP. After the First World War, this was only 2.5%. So this hope that the empire could be made profitable was made more difficult to achieve as a result of the economic circumstances. It was quickly concluded that change was necessary in order to make the empire viable, and Britain attempted to maintain its position while bringing down the costs. Now, the social and cultural impact of the war was just as important. The mood of 1918 was marked in Britain by a desire to avoid future conflict. The First World War, it was commonly said, should be a war to end all wars. And this placed the empire under additional scrutiny. Colonial forces may have fought alongside British troops, but this was not without protest. The war had, in fact, fostered a growing nationalism in those territories ruled by Britain. And this was a nationalism that also was seen much closer to home, as we'll hear when we consider the case of Ireland. Further afield, in India, for example, nationalists hoped that the support they'd provided to Britain during the war effort would lead to greater political representation. These hopes were not fulfilled by the British government. And they certainly weren't fulfilled by quite vague promises of eventual self-rule. And the level of unrest that this led to, so in India from 1917 onwards, there was a wave of protests and demonstrations. This unrest shocked colonial authorities who didn't really know how to respond and ended up responding quite bluntly with violence and emergency laws. And these events hastened the eventual collapse of Britain's imperial power because they made the protests even more vigorous. Now, at the time of this unrest, there was a widespread hope that a new international settlement could avoid future conflict. This settlement was given physical form by the League of Nations, of which we've heard something already today. The League of Nations, which was established in January 1920, was supposed to enforce a new global order that would allow nations to resolve difficulties through dialogue. Now, Britain's relationship with the League, and it became one of its most important members, Britain's relationship with the League signalled a further move away from empire. In 1917, the Imperial War Conference, which represented the dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, had agreed that there should be greater autonomy at the end of the war. The dominions were thus given independent representation at the Paris Peace Conference, and they became founding members of the League of Nations. Now, these themes encouraged a shift away from earlier ideas of empire. During the 1920s, there was increasing talk of a commonwealth of nations, a commonwealth that was bound together by mutual self-interest and a shared history. It should be noted, though, that this idea of a commonwealth, it was something that was reserved for places like Australia and Canada. India, although it was a member of the League of Nations and had also been represented in Paris, was not given the same rights. Now, the relationship between Britain and its empire, I think it becomes easier to understand if we consider an example. And for that reason, I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so before questions considering an exhibition that was held in 1924 and 1925 at Wembley. This was the British Empire exhibition, which was at the time the largest ever held in Britain and probably the most ambitious that had been held in the world. It's also a fascinating window into the way that Britain understood its empire and helps tell us something about the way that that was communicated to the public. The idea of an exhibition about empire had first been proposed in 1902, and the idea was very quickly revived after the First World War. At the time, this was designed to be a show of British power, a show of British strength, but also a show that Britain was looking to the future. Different parts of the empire were to be represented in purpose-built pavilions designed to invoke the territories that they represented. The image on the left shows a slightly small picture, but a picture which shows the Indian pavilion. This was designed to incorporate elements of both the Taj Mahal and the Jamal Mosque in India. So they were designed really to emulate those countries from which they came. Where am I? Sorry. The exhibition was very large. It cost £12 million to put on, covered a 216-acre site, and it also included 3 large exhibition halls, the largest of which was one of the biggest buildings in the world. There was a sports stadium, which went on to become the home of England Football Club. There were 54 restaurants and cafes, a miniature railway that transported visitors between the attractions, formal gardens, and a fun fair. The exhibition grounds were officially opened by King George V on the 24th of April 1924, which was St George's Day, and his opening speech was the first royal message to be broadcast by the BBC. This was a very important moment in sort of British post-war history. Now, the exhibition included an elaborate programme of activities. The highlight was a pageant of empire, which was held from the 21st of July to the 30th of August 1924. This pageant was designed to provide a historical overview of the empire's growth. It included 15,000 performers and a litany of animals from around the world. 730 camels, 72 monkeys and 3 bears took part in the performance. This is something, the sort of parallel that I would draw would be with the opening ceremony of an Olympics Games. This is an attempt to try to showcase the British Empire in a very playful and a very creative way. But certainly this was a very large performance with 15,000 actors and then these various animals. The main purpose of the exhibition, like the pageant, was to reproduce in miniature the British Empire. So all of the pavilions were themed, and the exhibition ground itself promised visitors the chance to explore the empire by travelling from India to Canada to New Zealand as they went through the attractions. The official guidebook described this as the ability to inspect the empire from end to end. Now, this was supported by an enormous publicity effort. Alongside the maps, the posters, and an official guidebook, there were 14 series of official postcards, a special series of postage stamps, and various special supplements in newspapers. There were, in total, 27 million visitors to this exhibition, including a few thousand, at least 5,000 from around the empire itself. But these were mostly British visitors. There is another flavour of some of this here, representing again the India Pavilion. The Empire exhibition signified British hopes for the future of its empire. The sheer scale of the event shows that Britain still regarded itself as an important imperial power, and that it regarded London as an imperial metropolis. Most of the exhibits put on display at this exhibition were also rooted in a pre-war belief of British superiority. And we see this with the way that the exhibits were designed to sort of showcase primitive or native cultures. This was, in many ways, a Victorian-era exhibition in the 1920s. However, the exhibition also represented Britain looking to the future. The two largest exhibition halls were called the Palace of Engineering and the Palace of Industry, while official advertising claimed that 4.5 acres of the site was devoted solely to the production of electricity. So this was an empire that could also embrace technology and innovation. There was evidence also of a new fascination with imperial modernity. It should be stressed that the aim of this exhibition was as much about fostering trade with the empire as it was about entertaining the public. It was not unimportant that the exhibition was the responsibility of the British Board of Trade, or that the Hong Kong pavilion was staffed by 150 Chinese merchants. This was an exhibition that was designed consciously to promote an idea of empire fit for the 20th century and fit, importantly, for the post-war world. However, the exhibition also demonstrated just how uncertain this post-war world was. Despite the organisers' best efforts, the exhibition lost hundreds of thousands of pounds. Despite their desire to foster mutual cooperation, those representing British overseas territories endured terrible working conditions in pavilions that had few facilities. Despite seeking to depoliticise the empire, the India Pavilion was also forced to close in 1925 as a result of increased unrest in the subcontinent. And despite looking to the future, there was little sense from those responsible about what the exhibition was designed to do. And when it closed, most of the site was very quickly demolished. This is perhaps a fitting analogy for the British Empire itself during the course of the 20th century. So in summary, the First World War is now understood as an important point of change within the history of the British Empire. Those who lived through the war could scarcely have imagined what would happen during the course of the 20th century. The British Empire at that time appeared to be at its height, and events like Empire Day and the Empire Exhibition show a degree of confidence about the future. During the course of the 20th century, however, Britain's role would change dramatically. And looking back at this from 100 years, from 100 years' time, it now seems like a very, very different country to the one that I know, and a very different type of Britain from the one which I'm familiar with. And this, I suppose, is a reminder of just how different the world was 100 years ago, a timely reminder as we celebrate Finland's 100th anniversary of independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for the wonderfully visual presentation. I suggest that we collect questions because yours and the next presentation also belong together. So if,
fantastic.
Yeah.
I will leave.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I have the honor to introduce to you Mary E. Daly, Professor Emerita at the University College Dublin. Over the course of her distinguished career, she has researched and published widely on various aspects of Irish history, from politics and economy to population issues, and not to forget gender issues. And in 2014, Mary E. Daly made history when being elected president of the Royal Irish Academy. Namely, she is the first female president in the history of this over 200 years old institution. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. And I decided I go on off PowerPoint, and I decided that I would have more flexibility in my presentation if I didn't use it here today. It's a great privilege to be in Helsinki to celebrate the centenary of Finland's revolution. For various reasons. We in Ireland are midway through what we are terming a decade of centenaries, the events 100 years ago that shaped contemporary Ireland. And as somebody who's one of the government's expert advisory group, we advise the government how to handle the revolution. We have been determined to make the people in Ireland understand that they are not unique and that there are a lot of comparative experiences. And I think the Finnish example is really important for us. We are two countries a distance apart, but we share so much in common. 19th century, famine, emigration, we're small nations with powerful neighbours. And again, in the 19th century, we both underwent cultural revolution based on our language, our historical heritage, our legends and our folklore, and these are very, very important. And we both underwent revolutions 100 years ago, and sadly, we both experienced civil wars in the aftermath. So I think it's important to present a wider context. The Irish story was, like all the others we've heard this morning, shaped by the Great War, but it actually goes back a little bit earlier into some of the political and social events of the 19th century when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom and Irish members sat at Westminster. Under the Union, Ireland did experience major advances in terms of mass primary education, basic health care, etc. But in an age of industrialisation, Ireland remained poor and agrarian. The only area that successfully industrialised was northeast Ulster, of which more anon. And the story of famine, emigration and population decline, which is the 19th century Irish story, the loss of the Irish language as the language of the people, all fuelled a demand for independence and a sense of wrong. But there are features of what Ireland learned under the Union that I think are quite important in shaping our revolution compared with the ones we've heard about this morning. First of all, there was a remarkably precocious emergence of mass political movements in Ireland from the 1820s. Daniel O'Connell campaigning for Catholic rights, campaigning for repeal of the Union, and later under other leaders campaigning for land reform and devolved government home rule. And this was a politicization that involved even the poorest people in Ireland, those that didn't have the vote. They joined political movements, even though the other point about Irish parliamentary politics is it didn't stay in Parliament the way British parliamentary politics would have done. There was huge grassroots momentum, and it also shades into revolutionary violence on occasion. The links between the divisions between revolution and parliamentary politics are not as firm as one might expect. And I think that is quite important also. Secondly, almost uniquely in Europe, the Catholic Church was a church of the poor, and it was a church that was not associated with the established order. It was sympathetic to democratic progress, and at times even sympathetic. Some of the clergy would even have been sympathetic to revolution, and I think that is quite important. And with the loss of Irish language, Catholicism becomes in many ways a surrogate badge of national identity for Ireland. And then the third point is that Ireland, by the beginning of the 20th century, had largely undergone a peaceful social revolution while under British control. The political and economic influence of the landed gentry, who were Anglo-Irish, Protestant, Unionist, had largely disappeared. They had lost control of local government. They no longer controlled seats, very many seats in Westminster from Ireland. And 3/4 of Irish peasant farmers were in the process of buying their land from the landlords with loans from the British Parliament. The country had a very small, landless, labouring population, mainly because of emigration. So social revolution was, in a sense, a peaceful event. It was over before you get an Irish revolution. The only area with a substantial industrial proletariat was northeast Ulster, and I'll say a little more of that later. From the 1880s, the overwhelming majority of Irish members of Parliament in Westminster favoured devolved government, a home rule. About 80% of MPs would have been, 75-80% of MPs would have voted for home rule. Home rule wasn't seen as the ultimate answer to Irish aspirations. This was regularly said, but it was seen as a measure of autonomy that would meet a lot of demands. And from the 1880s, under Gladstone, one of the two leading British political parties, the Liberals, was committed to advancing Home Rule in Ireland. But if the Liberals were committed to progressing Home Rule, the Conservative Party, or to give it its full name, as Theresa May did when she became Prime Minister, the Conservative and Unionist Party, was equally committed to retaining the Union. So you have the Irish question as a fundamental fault line in British politics. And within Ireland, you have a large majority in favour of nationalism and devolved government, a small influential minority, the landed elite, though they're losing power, the professional elite in many ways, and a significant concentration in northeast Ulster that are determined that Ireland will remain part of the United Kingdom. So Home Rule is an issue on the political agenda from the 1880s. A Liberal Party is committed to delivering it, cannot do so because the House of Lords will effectively block it. That changes in 1912. The Home Rule Bill is introduced. It will, if it passes Westminster on 3 occasions, it will become law. So it is now imminent. This is before World War I begins. But once that becomes an apparent inevitability, opposition within Ireland to Home Rule materialises. So Ireland's revolution starts with a counter-revolution, another paradox, because it is the marshalling of Ulster, people in Ulster, to block Home Rule, a solemn leaguing covenant signed by a very large section of the population, and the organising of a volunteer army, over 100,000 men, with guns from Germany to defend Ireland to defend the Union in Ireland. I should add that in the historic province of Ulster, it was roughly 50% nationalist, 50% unionist, and the electoral balance shifted almost every election between 18 nationalist, 17 unionist. But in part of Ulster, there was a very strong unionist majority. So with Ulster armed, nationalist Ireland sets up its volunteer army again, imports weapons from Germany to protect Home Rule. So on the eve of the Great War, Ireland has 2 very dangerous armed camps, about 200,000 men notionally lined up on different sides, both with arms and volunteers, and a real threat of civil war in the country. To prevent it, you get a conference at Buckingham Palace under the King to try and work out a solution to the Irish question. The leading British politicians are there, and so too are the leading Irish politicians, nationalist and unionist. And the conference effectively agrees that the solution will be partition. Nobody's clear on where the boundaries are going to lie, bigger or smaller, nor is it clear whether this is going to be permanent or temporary. But there was real danger in the summer of 1914 that Ireland would break out into civil war between the 2 camps. So there was actually strange relief in some quarters when World War I broke out, a horrible feeling. I mean, there's the famous Churchill quote of getting away from the grey spires of Tyrone and Fermanagh into this kind of more exciting scene in Europe. When the war breaks out, Home Rule is put on the statute book, but it is postponed. Nothing will happen until the war ends. The war is, at the beginning, expected to be a very short war. In Ireland, about 250,000 people, both Unionist, Nationalist, Catholic and Protestant, joined the British forces. and in a sense that dissipates the armed presence in the country. But on the nationalist side, a small minority don't join the British forces, nor do they really emotionally embrace the cause for the British cause. In fact, they stand aside. As Home Rule was never seen as the ultimate answer, the war was now seen as giving an opportunity for a more revolutionary solution to the Irish question. So what you get during the war is this rump Irish volunteers, a small group within that who belonged to the secret Republican movement, the Fenian Brotherhood, who'd engaged in various operations over the years, always very unsuccessfully. They can be described as terrorists in many ways. And this organisation manages to organise a revolution in Ireland. They made approaches to Germany, mainly through Irish America, for assistance. Germany was not very keen, actually, on helping Ireland. They really admired Britain, and they did send a shipment of arms, but no troops, and the shipment of arms was scuttled before it was captured by the British and never landed in Ireland. But nevertheless, on Easter Monday, 1916, you do get a revolution in Ireland. In Dublin, the proclamation of a republic. And that proclamation is important because it ups the aspirations and ambitions for an Irish settlement. The term republic, which, as you said this morning, was not much used in Europe at the time, was quite uncommon, is now very realistically on the Irish agenda. The revolution lasted 6 days. About 450 people or so were killed, most of them civilians. And it never really had much chance of success. There is a debate in Ireland to the effect that it was simply a blood sacrifice, and World War I is very much a time of such emotional language. What it was really was a call by some people for a more creative, imaginative, noble, aspirational Ireland than what Home Rule would have brought, the mundanities of Home Rule, a greater sense of idealism and ambition. Public opinion didn't like that rising. There was a lot of hostility to it, particularly among those whose families were fighting on the Western Front. But within about a year or so, opinion shifts. It shifts partly because of the executions of the leaders. Now, I think they're perfectly understandable. Britain was at war. The proclamation had mentioned gallant allies in Europe, so I think the executions were almost inevitable. But some of those executed were very minor figures and should not have been executed, and they arrested 2.5 times the numbers who actually took part in the rising, including people who were opposed to it. So there is a spreading disaffection. The fact that Ulster Unionists joined the coalition government in Britain also leads to further disaffection. And most importantly, the threat of conscription in Ireland is something that does really engage mass opinion. So by the end of 1917, it is clear that public opinion in Ireland has shifted into something which becomes the legacy of 1916. And from a kind of a small military operation, it now moves into a much broader political front. Sinn Féin emerges as the party that is the heir of the 1916 rebels. They begin to craft a new, more political stance, which is going to be that the case of Ireland will be brought to the post-war peace conference and resolved there. So you get lobbying on that in the United States and a general international campaign to that effect. The 1918 general election, which was mentioned earlier, did bring a landslide change in Ireland. Sinn Féin won most of the seats won pretty well all the seats outside Ulster, except for a couple of university seats. And instead of taking their presence in Westminster, they establish an Irish Republic in January 19 in Dublin. And they begin to demand a seat at the peace conference where the Irish case will be determined. Within Ireland, they set up an alternative government with mixed success. A local government system, a system of courts to adjudicate on land disputes and other kinds of disputes. They set up a fledgling diplomatic service, which is moderately successful, and they also set up a very good international information system to let people know what's happening. The military side of this was much more pragmatic than this mad 1916 rising. It concentrated on making British rule in Ireland impossible, a bit like some of the things described earlier. Breaking down the police system caused mass resignations among the police force, destroying tax offices, gathering arms and so on. So you get from 1919 to 21 a degree of guerrilla warfare in the country, which in itself has a certain amount of nastiness attached to it, atrocities and so forth, but very minor compared with what you get in Eastern Europe in these years. Britain didn't give that much attention to Ireland initially. They were very preoccupied with the Paris Conference. And they refused to recognise this kind of intermittent guerrilla campaign attacks by men who didn't wear uniforms as a war, and they tried to deal with it through a combination of a paramilitary police force and other such activities, which didn't help in terms of law and order. And the result is a certain amount of unpleasant events, burning houses and properties as reprisal, burning the centre of Cork City in retaliation for when their troops had been killed. Events that did not help the sense of the image of Britain internationally, which were heavily promulgated by the Irish information services at the time. I think it's important to say that Britain could have defeated the revolution in Ireland if Britain had set out to do so, but the cost politically and internationally would have been extremely high. Secondly, bear in mind, Britain has conceded the principle of devolved government to Ireland in 1914, so it looks crazy to be fighting on that level. In 1920, Britain passed the Government of Ireland Act, which set up 2 Home Rule parliaments, one in Belfast for 6 counties. It gave roughly 2/3 unionist majority, 1/3 nationalist in that area. And it was going to set up a similar Home Rule devolved parliament in Dublin. But Dublin had gone long past the very limited powers that Home Rule would have given. Home Rule would have given Ireland much less power than the Scottish Assembly has today, for example. So the war continued for another few months. But you're down to, at this stage, the question of detail. How much autonomy is Britain prepared to concede? How much autonomy is nationalist Ireland prepared to accept? It's a matter of bargaining on those details. The Republic was, by this stage, a bit of a straitjacket. The Irish were committed to achieving a republic. Nobody ever worked out really what a republic meant in great detail, I hasten to add, except it was seen as a kind of a one-word term for independence. Britain would not concede a republic in Ireland because of what we've just talked about earlier, the whole question of Henry, the whole question of the empire. India was the example that they really feared most. So a republic was not a possible solution to this. The settlement in 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, gave Ireland Dominion status, which, as Henry talked about, was something that had evolved a lot during World War I. And in the settlement, Ireland was given explicitly the same status as Canada. Now, there's one difference. Canada is a long way away. Ireland is very close. So while that's a great bonus, it doesn't have the same practical implications. The treaty did retain some practical powers and more symbolic ones. It required an oath of allegiance, for example, to the British monarch, which Irish nationalists did not like. and more practically, 3 British naval bases would be retained in Ireland, and that would have precluded any independent foreign policy. So what happens is a split among the Sinn Féin majority that have taken over Ireland in 1917-18. It's a split within the family and within families. It's a split between pragmatists and idealists. It's a split between those who see a lot of real independence and those who still hanker for the Republic, whatever it means. The Civil War was not fought on partition or Northern Ireland. I think it's important to emphasise that point. Northern Ireland is a thorn in the Irish story, but autonomy, sovereignty was seen as much more important. And we have a civil war which killed more people than either 1916 or the War of Independence, but a lot less than Finland, about 3,000 people in toto. And at the end, and again, the Civil War was suppressed with greater violence than the 1916 Rising. 77 people were executed compared with 16 in 1916. But by the end of 1923, the government in Dublin, the provisional government and the government of the Irish Free State has suppressed the Civil War. Secondly, a general election in 1922 has shown that about 2/3 of the people are in favour of the treaty, or in favour at least of peace. And democratic government is established at that time. I now want to move on to look a little bit at some of the features of the post-1922 story, insofar as that's what I'm trying to hold time for. First, there are several threads. The first I would emphasise is the triumph of democracy despite this revolutionary birth. The gradual acceptance by the overwhelming majority of those who opposed the treaty in 1921 that they should oppose it in future through Parliament, not through revolution. In 1932, less than a decade after Civil War, Fianna Fáil, the party that represented the losers in the Civil War, took government not through a coup but in a general election, and the other government handed power over peacefully, the civil service moved peacefully, the army adapted to the transition in power peacefully, and that is a really important achievement. And from thereafter, you can see in successive decades, 1940s, and again most recently in the 1980s, the revolutionary groups who are engaged in violence within the state gradually moving into the parliamentary process. What I think this reflects is the 19th century legacy of the Union and Ireland's constitutional tradition, which was deeply ingrained. And Ireland has been a very lucky country born in this aftermath of the Great War, having enjoyed a century of democratic government and no invasion, quite a peaceful life. Secondly, revolution Irish style, as I've said, is not a major social revolution. The land reforms had taken place before 1914. There wasn't an industrial proletariat, except in Northern Ireland. And although the Catholic Church came out very strongly against those who fought on the Republican side in the Civil War, Ireland never developed an anti-treaty party, or an anti-clerical party, which is quite unusual. So you get a country that is Catholic, agrarian, and socially conservative. There are changes in the elite, the judiciary, the politicians, but many of the former British civil servants stayed there until they reached retirement age, though they had very good terms for opting for retirement if they so wished. There wasn't a significant cultural revolution. Despite sustained efforts to make Irish the official language, it doesn't become the language of everyday life. But it was a qualified success. The language lived, and it's still alive in contemporary media today. There's a long-standing debate within Ireland which suggests that a home rule settlement, as on offer in 1914, would in time have given Ireland full independence, without violence and without partition. I think the evidence doesn't really support that. The first thing to note is that partition was implicit in any Home Rule settlement by 1914. And partition remains, as I said, really, it wasn't a factor in the Civil War. Partition only comes in the Irish agenda when full sovereignty has been achieved. So it's sovereignty first, full independence first, and then let's start looking at Northern Ireland. As for full independence, the 1920s does see Ireland continuing to try to extricate itself from its remaining entanglements with Britain. During the 1920s, it works through common Dominion conferences. It's the leader of the pack among the Dominions to try and really push Dominion status to its ultimate. And in 1931, Britain grants all the Dominions under the Statute of Westminster the effective autonomy that from 1931, Dominions are not subject to the British Parliament. They are not subject to Westminster. They are subject only to the monarchy. And I think for the other Dominions, that was more than sufficient for their needs. Not necessarily for Ireland. The push continues in all kinds of ways. A separate Irish passport, which does not declare that Irish people are British subjects, Irish citizenship rights, the letters of accreditation of Irish diplomats, and much more. In 1936, when the abdication crisis hits Britain, King Edward is abdicating, the Irish actually take advantage of abdication to push through legislation that effectively removes the Crown from any role in domestic Irish life whatsoever. The only remaining power is that they continue to sign the letters of Irish diplomats for some time. And in 1937, Ireland introduces a constitution that is a republican constitution in all but name. But the British monarch continues to use the title King of Ireland until 1952, when it was dropped under Queen Elizabeth. It's still there, and it remained a significant issue of tension. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain, during his appeasement phase, decided that a peaceful, neutral Ireland would be easier to deal with if there was a war than an Ireland that they engaged, that they brought in as to fight on the British side. And the 3 naval ports were handed back, much to Winston Churchill's horror, and he did try to get them back some years later. So that meant that when war broke out in 1939, Ireland did remain neutral, and that was the ultimate statement of Irish sovereignty. I think it was the only stance that could have been taken for a country that was independent for less than 20 years. The return of British troops would simply have provoked yet another civil war and would have provoked Republican elements to build links with Germany. But it was a neutrality that came with a significant price in the aftermath of World War II. Ireland in the 1920s saw internationalism as a way of enhancing its sovereignty. They played a very active role in the League of Nations. They insisted on signing everything independently. Britain tried to suggest, well, we'll sign for all the dominions. The Irish were insistent on their signature going on everything. De Valera was president of the League of Nations in the 1930s. Sean Lemass, a future Prime Minister as well, was president of the International Labour Organization. They were active in the Secretariat. They were active in the assemblies. That is until the League failed to deal with Italian aggression in Africa in the late 1930s, at which point De Valera decided that withdrawal, neutrality was the only way for a small nation to survive. But that neutrality continued in the aftermath of World War II. Ireland decided not to join NATO while invited, not for any high-minded reasons, but because a very maladroit foreign minister at the time thought that they could parley a NATO membership for American support to end partition in Northern Ireland. Absolutely crazy and horrible stance to take. So Ireland does not join NATO. Because of its wartime neutrality, Ireland is not admitted to the United Nations until 1955, same year as Finland. But from 1956 onwards, the United Nations sees a much more a return to a more international engagement by the Irish state, which I think is very significant. Peacekeeping, nuclear non-proliferation, and in more recent years, development aid. But I think the ultimate advance of Irish sovereignty comes actually in 1973, when Ireland becomes a member of the European Union. We didn't join before that because Britain was being effectively vetoed by de Gaulle, and Irish economic dependence on Britain was such it would have been very difficult to go solo. But EU membership has been extraordinarily significant in a variety of ways, in diversifying, in benefiting the economy, diversifying its links with Britain, enabling Ireland to join the euro as opposed to being dependent on sterling, where a lot of financial policy was effectively determined in Britain. And also, I think, achieving mutual equality and regard with Britain. I think that really came most as common membership of the EU, and that has proved extremely important when both were trying to see their way through the Northern Ireland crisis, because it did provide a neutral space where a lot of informal friendships, connections, and conversations could take place. So I've gone through a very long period, and just to sum it up, I think in one phrase, I think people in Ireland think we've a miserable history. There's this kind of theory that we're the most oppressed people ever. I don't think we are. And I think that the Irish revolutionary story is very much a good luck story. We avoided a civil war between unionist and nationalist on 3 occasions, 1914, again in 1922, and again in 1969. And while civil war within the nationalist family was not pleasant, the other would have been so much more damaging. We protected democracy. And I think in terms of sovereignty, the clear message for us as a small country is that multilateralism matters, and multilateralism is a very important way of enhancing sovereignty. So thank you very much.
So now we have time, a couple of minutes for questions or comments, and the micro is okay, please.
Alexei Gusev, Moscow University. First of all, I would like to thank colleagues for very interesting presentations. And my question to all 3 of you. You know that in Russia now there is many talks about the German interference in Russian affairs during the war in order to destabilize Russia politically and win the war. And the State Central Television celebrated the centenary of the 1917 revolution by demonstrating films showing how it was Germany which organized revolution in Russia. And there is a new historical mythology about the German gold as a key for the revolution. So my question is, how would you assess the real extent of German involvement in supporting national liberation or separatist movements in such regions like the colonies of British Empire, Ireland and Finland? Where are the myths and where are the truth? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what I would say, is this working? Yeah. Germany showed very little sympathy for the Irish nationalist cause in World War I because they ultimately admired Britain, and I think they regarded Ireland as a rather inferior a presence by comparison. There was an attempt made by Roger Casement, a man who had been involved, former British consular official, who'd been involved in exposing human rights abuses in the Congo and in the Putumayo in the Amazon Basin, to organise an Irish brigade among Irish prisoners of war in Germany. He went round and he got a small colony together in Limburg, and he wanted to bring them back to Ireland to fight for Irish independence. But he got very little attention. There's a lot of work on that. He got very little sympathy in Germany, and more to the point, the Germans at one stage suggested that they wanted to bring that Irish brigade to fight in the Middle East to destabilize the warfare over there. In other words, the Germans saw if this troop had managed to cohere, they all fell away in time. But if that brigade had managed to cohere in any way, the Germans wanted to use them. The Germans wanted to use them in the Middle East, not to bring Irish independence. So I think that answers the question for Ireland anyway.
Dmitry Frolov, National Archives of Finland. Thank you very much for the very interesting reports. Actually, I'd like to ask about the Easter Rising. So, led by Pierce Conley, MacDermott, what was it? What was it? Was it a rising? Was it a pre-revolution, a revolution, or was it an unsuccessful first step of the civil war in Ireland?
I think you could describe it as a coup, if you wished. It is often described as carried out by a minority of a minority. There was this large Irish volunteer force, 100,000 or so, that was to defend Ireland against Home Rule. A lot of those members joined the British forces when war broke out. A lot of the others simply went home to the farm and lived quietly. A minority of about 20,000 or maybe less remained active, and they were committed to mobilizing, not clear why, but if conscription was introduced, they would probably mobilize. But they were infiltrated by members of the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood, which was a secret organisation that had been in existence for about 50 years, that had tried various terrorist offences in Britain, tried to blow up the House of Parliament, tried to blow up Westminster Bridge, generally, unfortunately, unsuccessfully. And they infiltrated the Irish Volunteers. They got key positions within the Army Council, and they planned the rising. Fewer than 50 people knew that a rising was going to happen until literally the day before. So I think it has to be seen as something of a coup. As I said, it's often described as a blood sacrifice. The Pierce, who wrote poetry and he was put in as leader because he had a wonderful way with words. It was his communication skills. And Pierce is often seen as wanting to have a blood sacrifice, doing it at Easter. There's a whole literature looking at the relationship between the Christian sacrifice and the Irish sacrifice and so forth. But I think it's more a statement by some people saying, Ireland is getting very dull, mundane. Self-government it does not meet the aspirations of the cultural nationalism that has emerged. They want a more heroic Ireland that is different to Britain and different to, in many ways, stepping aside from the modern world. And the rising effectively captured some of that opinion. So I don't see it as a civil war. I don't see it as a civil war as such. The civil war that emerged in 1922 is in many ways almost accidental. It It's very strange. Some of the people you thought might go one side, go the other side. You can try and break down all those who took different sides in the Civil War, all those who voted against the treaty. There is some bias towards poorer people. There is some bias towards those who are more military active, but it's very, very random. The only group is that all the women who were members of Parliament opposed the treaty, but many of them did so because they reflected the spirit of dead men, which they wished to remember.
Yeah, thank you. And the last comment goes to Risto Alapuro.
To answer Professor Gusev's question about the Germany's role in the Finnish process of independence and civil war, yes, Germany was very heavily involved in that process. German troops took part in the civil war on the white side in 1918, and Finland would have remained very strongly dependent on Germany without the collapse of the German Empire. So happily, first Russian Empire collapsed, and then German Empire collapsed.
So thank you for the chair, and thank you for the speakers and for the discussions. Now we have a break of a bit more than 1 hour. For the speakers, we have your name lists. You can go up to the restaurant that is in the 8th floor. We are now in the 6th floor because we have some depots underground, so that your names are there. Please go to the cafe house, and we have also opportunity to go to another restaurant to avoid queues. That is named Piano. It is just 100 meters from here, and the UN youth who are here will be guiding you also to that restaurant, so that I suggest that we divide us and go to the both restaurants. But for the speakers, please go up to the cafe house. Thank you.